August 2nd, 1943, 0230 hours, Blackson Strait, Solomon Islands. The night was moonless, the water black as oil, the humidity so thick that every breath felt like drowning in warm soup. Lieutenant John F. Kennedy stood at the helm of Petit 109, squinting into darkness so complete that he could not see his own hands on the wheel. Somewhere out there, beyond the wall of black, Japanese destroyers were running supplies to their garrison on Kolombangara. His job was to find them and sink them. He never got the chance. Kennedy was watching the water ahead when the darkness itself seemed to shift. For a fraction of a second, his mind refused to process what he was seeing. A shape was emerging from the night, massive and impossibly fast, darker than the water around it. He could see the phosphorescent glow of a bow wave cutting toward him like a blade. The Japanese destroyer, Amagiri, was doing 30 knots, nearly 35 miles per hour, driving through the strait without lights, without warning, without hesitation. PT 109 was nearly stationary, idling on a single engine to minimize its wake and exhaust signature. The boat was drifting, essentially dead in the water. Kennedy had perhaps 3 seconds, maybe less. He spun the wheel hard to starboard, shouting for power, his voice lost in the sudden roar of the approaching ship. But a PT boat idling on one engine cannot accelerate. It cannot turn. It can only sit there while 2,000 tons of armored steel bears down on it at the speed of a freight train. The Amagiri struck POT 109 just aft of the cockpit at a 30-degree angle. The impact was not a collision in any conventional sense. The destroyer's knife-edge bow did not push the little plywood boat aside. It did not bounce off or shove it under. It cut through the hull like a sword through flesh, slicing Pakititi 109 completely in half, with a sound that survivors would later describe as a massive cracking explosion, as if the boat itself were screaming. The stern section, containing the engine room, the fuel tanks, and all 4 torpedo tubes, was crushed and spun away into the darkness. 100-octane aviation gasoline, the same fuel used in fighter planes, sprayed across the water and ignited on contact with the hot metal of the destroyer's hull. A wall of orange fire erupted behind the Amagiri's wake, spreading outward in every direction, turning the black night into a hellscape of burning water. Inside that fire, men were dying. Kennedy was thrown through the air by the force of the impact, his body twisting, the breath driven from his lungs. He slammed against the deck of what remained of the bow section and lay there stunned, unable to move, unable to think. When he finally lifted his head, the rest of his boat was gone. The Amagiri had vanished into the night, continuing on its course without even slowing down. The destroyer's captain had not realized what he had hit. He probably thought he had struck flotsam or debris. The burning gasoline lit the water in patches of orange and black, the flames dancing on the surface, the smoke rising into the moonless sky. Kennedy could hear screaming from somewhere beyond the flames, the voices of his crew, lost in the darkness, burning or drowning, or both. This is the story of PT 109, the most famous small craft disaster of the Second World War. But it is not a story about a boat. It is not a story about naval tactics or torpedo doctrine or the strategic situation in the Solomon Islands. It is a story about 11 men trapped behind enemy lines, 30 miles from the nearest American base, surrounded by Japanese-controlled waters, without a radio, without weapons, without hope of rescue. It is a story about swimming through shark-infested waters, about survival measured in mouthfuls of rancid coconut milk, about the slow collapse of the human body under conditions of extreme dehydration and exhaustion. And it is a story about a future president, not yet 26 years old, dragging a badly burned crewman through 4 miles of open ocean with a life jacket strap clenched between his teeth, refusing to let go, refusing to stop, refusing to die. This is not a tale of naval glory. This is a tale of what happens when everything has already gone wrong, and the only choice left is to keep moving or to give up. To understand what happened that night in Blackson Strait, you must first understand what PT boats were, what they were designed to do, and why that design made them simultaneously deadly and suicidally vulnerable. The letters stood for patrol torpedo. These were small, fast, wooden-hulled vessels designed for a single purpose: to close with enemy warships at night, launch torpedoes at point-blank range, and escape at high speed before the enemy could bring their guns to bear. They were approximately 80 feet long, narrow-beamed, built from double-planked mahogany over oak frames. 3 Packard V12 engines, each generating over 1,000 horsepower, could push them past 40 knots in calm water. They carried 4 Mark 8 torpedoes, each weighing nearly 3,000 pounds, along with several machine guns and depth charges. On paper, they were the terrors of the narrow seas: small, fast, nearly invisible at night, capable of destroying a battleship with a single, well-placed torpedo spread. In practice, PT boats were made of plywood. Their hulls had no armor whatsoever. A single well-placed machine gun burst could puncture the fuel tanks and turn the entire vessel into an inferno. Their torpedoes were notoriously unreliable, prone to running deep, running crooked, or failing to detonate even when they struck their target. Their tactics were still being invented by trial and error, mostly error, and those errors were measured in dead men. The crews who volunteered for PT service were young, aggressive, and motivated by a combination of patriotism and the desire for something more exciting than convoy escort duty. The Navy recruitment materials made PT boats sound glamorous, like motorboat racing with guns. The reality was that PT boats were floating coffins, wrapped in 3,000 gallons of aviation gasoline, sent out into the darkness to engage warships that could destroy them with a single salvo. By the summer of 1943, the PT squadrons operating in the Solomon Islands had accumulated enough experience to understand exactly how dangerous their job was. The Japanese Navy had not cooperated with American assumptions about night combat. Instead of running from PT boats, Japanese destroyers and cruisers hunted them. The Imperial Japanese Navy had spent a decade perfecting night fighting tactics, training their lookouts to spot targets in absolute darkness, drilling their gun crews to engage small, fast-moving vessels. The Tokyo Express, the nightly destroyer runs that supplied Japanese ground forces on Guadalcanal and the other contested islands, moved through the Solomons with near impunity. American PT boats tried to intercept them, firing torpedoes into the darkness at radar contacts that might be destroyers, or might be fishing boats, or might be absolutely nothing. Sometimes the torpedoes hit something, usually they did not, and sometimes, too often, the PT boats themselves became the targets. The night of August 1st, 1943, was supposed to be a major interdiction operation. Intelligence had reported a large Japanese convoy moving through Blackson Strait. 4 destroyers carrying troops and supplies to reinforce the garrison on Kolombangara. 15 PT boats from 3 different squadrons deployed to intercept. The operation was ambitious. It was also chaotic from the moment it began. Radio communications broke down almost immediately. The PT boats spread out across the pitch-black water in loose formations that quickly disintegrated into scattered individual patrols. Radar contacts came and went, most of them false returns from the islands themselves or from the confused wakes of the PT boats themselves. Several boats made contact with what they believed were enemy ships, fired their torpedoes into the darkness, and withdrew without knowing whether they had hit anything. Most of them had not. PT-109 was one of the boats that failed to engage at all. Kennedy and his crew had been cruising slowly through the strait for hours, searching the darkness, listening to sporadic, garbled radio traffic, unable to locate the Japanese convoy and increasingly uncertain whether the convoy was even in the area they had been assigned to patrol. There was another problem, one that Kennedy had been dealing with for weeks. PT-109's engines were failing. 2 of the 3 Packard motors had been running rough for over a month. Replacement parts were essentially unavailable in the forward areas. The boat could still make reasonable speed on all 3 engines, but the power output was unpredictable, and Kennedy had learned to be cautious about demanding full throttle when the situation did not absolutely require it. Tonight, he was idling on a single engine, trying to minimize wake and exhaust to avoid detection. It was standard doctrine for PT boats on night patrol. Run quiet, stay invisible, wait for a target to appear on radar or in the binoculars of the bridge watch. The problem was that running on one engine also meant the boat could not accelerate quickly if something went wrong. Something was about to go very wrong indeed. The Amagiri was part of the returning convoy, 4 destroyers that had successfully delivered their cargo to Kolombangara and were now racing back toward Rabaul at flank speed. They were running without lights, without radar emissions that might alert American patrol aircraft, moving through the strait on a course that would take them directly across the patrol zone where PT-109 was drifting. The destroyer's lookouts may have spotted PT-109 in the final seconds before impact. They may not have. The evidence is contradictory, and none of the Japanese crewmen who survived the war left detailed accounts of that specific moment. What is certain is that the Amagiri made no attempt to evade. The destroyer's captain held his course and speed, either unaware of the small boat in his path or indifferent to it. When 2,000 tons of steel meets 80 feet of plywood at a combined closing speed of over 35 knots, the outcome is not in question. The forward section of PT-109, containing the cockpit, forward crew quarters, and the small compartment where Kennedy had been standing, remained intact but was flooding fast. The bulkheads that were supposed to provide flotation had been compromised by the impact, and seawater was pouring into every crack and seam. Within minutes, only a small portion of the bow remained above water, tilted at an odd angle, riding lower with every passing wave. The after section, containing the engine room with its 3 massive Packard motors, the fuel tanks filled with aviation gasoline, and the 4 loaded torpedo tubes, was simply gone. It had been crushed, split, and scattered across the dark water, some of it burning, some of it sinking, some of it floating in fragments that bobbed in the orange glow of the spreading fire. There were 13 men aboard T-109 when the destroyer struck. In the seconds after impact, their world had been reduced to chaos, fire, darkness, and the absolute disorientation of being thrown from a reasonably safe vessel into a nightmare of burning water. 2 of them died in the first moments. Harold Marney was 19 years old, a motor machinist's mate from Massachusetts. He had been standing watch in the after section of the boat, near the engine room hatch. He was killed instantly when the Amagiri's bow crushed through that part of the hull. His body was never recovered. Andrew Jackson Kirksey was a torpedo man's mate from Georgia, 25 years old, married, planning to go home and start a family when his tour was up. He was in the engine room when the destroyer struck. The impact tore the compartment apart around him. He may have died instantly. He may have lived long enough to know what was happening. Either way, he never emerged from the wreckage. His body like Marnie's, was never found. The other 11 men were scattered across the water in various states of injury and shock. Several had been thrown clear of the boat and were now swimming in the darkness, unable to see the flames, unable to hear anything over the roaring of the fire and the pounding of blood in their own ears. Others had clung to the wreckage and were now trying to orient themselves, to understand what had happened, to figure out whether they were about to die. The worst off was Patrick Henry McMahon. McMahon was 37 years old, ancient by PT boat standards, a motor machinist's mate who had been standing near one of the fuel tanks when it ruptured. Burning gasoline had engulfed him before he could react. His face was severely burned. His hands and arms were covered in blistering tissue that was already beginning to peel away from the underlying flesh. The flames had seared his eyes, leaving him temporarily blinded. He was alive, but he was also in shock, barely conscious, completely unable to swim. When Kennedy surfaced after being thrown from the boat, he found himself in a world of fire and shadow. The burning gasoline had spread across the water in an irregular pattern, some patches flaming brightly, others dark and ominous, and it was impossible to tell which way led to safety. Oh, the smell was overwhelming, a combination of burning fuel, singed hair, and the metallic tang of blood. He could hear men shouting somewhere in the darkness, their voices distorted by distance and fear, but he could not see them. Kennedy was not a natural hero, not in the sense that some men seem born to war. He was the son of Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., one of the wealthiest and most politically connected men in America, a former ambassador to Great Britain who had opposed American entry into the war. Young Jack Kennedy had grown up in privilege, attended Harvard, traveled through Europe before the invasion, and lived a life that most of his crewmen could scarcely imagine. He had volunteered for PT service not out of any particular hunger for combat, but because he wanted to do something real, something that mattered, something that would prove he was more than just his father's son. He had spent much of the previous year suffering from chronic back problems that should have disqualified him from any kind of sea duty, let alone the pounding violence of a PT boat in combat. He had used his family's connections to get the medical waiver he needed to stay in service. Now none of that mattered. His wealth meant nothing. His father's influence meant nothing. His Harvard education and his political pedigree and his plans for the future all meant absolutely nothing. He was in the water, in the dark, surrounded by fire, and somewhere out there his men were dying. Kennedy began swimming toward the voices. He found them one by one, gathering them in the darkness, pulling them toward the wreckage of the bow section that was still somehow floating. Some of the men were uninjured. Others had burns, cuts, contusions from being thrown against the boat's structure. All of them were in shock to one degree or another, struggling to process what had happened, struggling to understand that they were now castaways in the middle of the Japanese-controlled Solomon Islands. McMahon was the most critical case. Kennedy found him floating in the water, barely conscious, his burned arms trailing uselessly at his sides. The skin on his hands had already begun to slough off. He could not grip anything, could not support himself, could barely keep his head above water. Kennedy hauled him to the wreckage and held him there, trying to assess the damage in the flickering light of the dying fires. There was nothing he could do. No medicine, no bandages, no way to treat burns of that severity. The best he could manage was to keep McMahon from drowning and hope that help would arrive. It did not. By the time all 11 survivors had gathered on the wreckage, the fires had burned themselves out. The darkness returned, absolute and total, pressing in from every direction. The men clung to the remaining section of hull, treading water, shivering despite the tropical warmth, waiting. They waited for another PT boat to come searching for them. They waited for a patrol plane to spot them in the first light of dawn. They waited for any sign that the United States Navy knew they were out there and cared enough to look for them. No one came. What the crew of PT-109 did not understand, what they could not have known, was the scale of the chaos that had consumed the entire operation that night. The 15-boat intercept mission had been a near-total failure. Communications had broken down. Several boats had fired torpedoes at contacts that may or may not have been enemy ships. Others had scattered across the strait and lost contact with their squadron commanders entirely. When the boats returned to their base at Rendova Island in the early hours of August 2nd, the counting revealed that PT-109 was missing, but the base staff initially assumed Kennedy had simply gotten separated and would return later. Then, they assumed he had gone to one of the other PT bases in the area. Then, as the hours passed and no word came, they began to realize that something had gone wrong. By dawn, the Navy listed PT-109 as overdue. By afternoon, search aircraft were dispatched to look for survivors. They found nothing. The debris had scattered, the wreckage had sunk, and the 11 men, clinging to a piece of floating hull, were invisible against the vast darkness of the Pacific. The search was called off after 48 hours. PT-109 and its crew were officially listed as missing and presumed lost. On the wreckage, Kennedy watched the sun go down on the second day and understood that no one was coming for them. The Solomon Islands in 1943 represented one of the most bitterly contested theaters of the entire Pacific War. The chain stretched for nearly 600 miles across the southwestern Pacific, a labyrinth of volcanic peaks, coral atolls, and jungle-choked coastlines that the Japanese had seized in the months after Pearl Harbor. By the time PT-109 went down, American forces had been fighting to recapture the Solomons for over a year. Guadalcanal had been secured, but at appalling cost. The waters around the islands had seen some of the most vicious naval battles of the war. Savo Island, the Eastern Solomons, Cape Esperance, Guadalcanal itself. So many ships had been sunk in the narrow waters between the islands that American sailors had given the area a grim nickname, Iron Bottom Sound. The Japanese still held most of the northern Solomons, including Kolombangara, the island that the Amagiri had been supplying when it cut through PT-109. They maintained coast watcher stations hidden in the jungle, patrol boats that cruised the channels between islands, float plane bases that could launch aircraft at a moment's notice. Any American sailor unlucky enough to wash ashore on a Japanese-held island could expect capture, interrogation, and very likely execution. And even if the Japanese did not find them, the islands themselves were hostile. The jungles were dense, malarial, infested with crocodiles and venomous snakes. Fresh water was scarce. Edible plants were almost non-existent unless you knew exactly what to look for. A man could die of thirst on an island surrounded by ocean, die of starvation in a jungle full of vegetation, die of infection from a minor wound that became septic in the tropical heat. And there was something else in these waters, something the men of PT-109 tried not to think about as they clung to their sinking wreckage. Sharks. The waters around the Solomon Islands were home to several species of shark, including oceanic white-tips and the occasional tiger shark. These predators were drawn to the sound and smell of disturbance in the water, thrashing, blood, the panic of injured creatures. The crew of PT-109 had been thrashing for hours. McMahon was bleeding from his burns. The smell of gasoline and burned flesh was spreading through the current. If the sharks came, there would be no defense. The men had no weapons except a single pistol that Kennedy had managed to keep from the wreck. They could not swim fast enough to escape. They could not climb out of the water onto the sinking hull, which was now barely breaking the surface. The sharks did not come, at least not in numbers sufficient to attack. But the men spent every moment waiting for them, staring into the black water, flinching at every ripple, feeling the primitive terror of being prey. By dawn of the first day, the wreckage was clearly going to sink completely. Kennedy made a decision. They could not stay where they were. They had to swim for land. He could see several islands in the distance, small dark shapes on the horizon, their jungles rising against the pale morning sky. The nearest one appeared to be Plum Pudding Island, a tiny oval of sand and scrub approximately 3 miles to the southeast. It looked uninhabited. It was their only chance. The problem was McMahon. The man could not swim. The burns on his hands and arms had destroyed his ability to grip or pull water. He could not even kick effectively. The pain was too severe. If he entered the water unsupported, he would drown within minutes. Kennedy made another decision. He would tow McMahon himself. He found a strap from McMahon's life jacket, approximately 3 feet of canvas webbing, and put it between his own teeth. McMahon would float face up in his kapok vest, and Kennedy would swim breaststroke ahead of him, pulling him along by the strap. It was an absurd plan. 3 miles was an enormous distance to swim under any circumstances. To do it while towing an injured man, with no rest and no support, was approaching impossible. Kennedy told his crew to follow him and entered the water. The swim took nearly 4 hours. 4 hours of breaststroke, alone with his thoughts, the strap cutting into the corners of his mouth, McMahon's weight dragging against him with every kick. 4 hours of watching the island grow slowly, painfully closer while the current tried to push them sideways, tried to drag them out into the open ocean where they would drift until they died. Behind Kennedy, the other 9 survivors struggled to keep pace. Some were strong swimmers, others were barely functional. They had no fins, no flotation aids beyond their kapok life jackets, no energy reserves after the trauma of the collision and the sleepless night on the wreckage. One by one, they began to fall behind. Kennedy could not stop to help them. If he stopped, McMahon would sink. If he slowed down, the current would take them. He had to keep swimming, stroke after stroke, pulling the strap with his teeth, kicking through water that seemed to grow heavier with every minute. His back began to seize. Kennedy's chronic back problems, the ones that should have kept him out of the Navy, were not imaginary. He had genuine spinal issues that flared up under stress, that sent shooting pain down his legs and made his muscles lock into agonizing cramps. Now, 4 hours into an impossible swim, his back was failing him, but he kept moving. One moment from that swim has been recorded in multiple accounts, confirmed by survivors, and it deserves to be remembered. Somewhere in the 3rd hour, Kennedy stopped swimming. He was exhausted to the point of collapse. His arms had stopped responding properly. His legs were cramping. The salt water had rubbed his lips raw against the canvas strap. He looked back at McMahon, still floating, still barely conscious, still completely dependent on Kennedy to keep him alive. And Kennedy considered letting go. The temptation must have been overwhelming. He was 25 years old. He wanted to live. He wanted to see his family again, his brothers, his sisters, the future that was waiting for him back in Massachusetts. All he had to do was open his mouth, let the strap fall away, and swim for shore alone. McMahon would drift for a while, and then he would sink, and no one would ever know exactly what had happened out there in the darkness of the Solomons. Kennedy did not let go. He kept swimming. They reached Plum Pudding Island sometime in the late morning. The island was exactly what it appeared to be from the water, a tiny oval of sand, perhaps 100 yards across at its widest point, with a few scraggly palm trees and some thorny underbrush growing in the thin soil above the high water mark. There was no fresh water, there was no food, there was no shelter from air observation. But it was land. Kennedy dragged McMahon onto the beach, his own legs barely able to support him, and collapsed beside his crewman in the shade of a palm tree. Behind him, the other 9 survivors were still coming in, strung out across a quarter-mile of water, struggling and splashing their way toward shore. The last man reached the beach nearly an hour after Kennedy. By that point, several of them had given up swimming and were simply floating, letting the current and their life jackets carry them toward the island while they drifted in and out of consciousness. For the next 6 days, Kennedy and his crew would fight a different kind of war, a war without weapons, a war measured in thirst and hunger and the constant fear of discovery. They had survived the collision. They had survived the fire. They had survived the 4-hour swim, but they had survived only to confront a different kind of death, slower and more insidious. They were going to die of thirst. The first priority was water, and there was none. Plum Pudding Island was a coral atoll, essentially a thin layer of sand and organic matter over a foundation of porous limestone. There was no soil deep enough to hold a freshwater lens, no streams, no springs, nothing. Kennedy sent men to explore every inch of the tiny island while he tended to McMahon and tried to assess their overall situation. The report: the island had no edible plants, no wildlife except for the occasional coconut crab scuttling across the sand. The men grew weaker by the hour, their bodies consuming themselves in the absence of nutrition. By the second day on Plum Pudding, several of the men were showing symptoms of serious dehydration. Their urine had turned dark amber, their lips were cracked and bleeding, their eyes had begun to sink into their skulls. McMahon's burns were weeping fluid and beginning to show the early signs of infection, red streaks spreading outward from the blistered tissue. Without antibiotic treatment, the infection would spread to his bloodstream. Without fresh water, they would all be dead within another few days. And always, there was the fear. Japanese aircraft passed overhead regularly, their engines droning across the humid sky, their shadows crossing the tiny island like omens. Japanese patrol boats cruised the strait, sometimes passing so close that the men could hear voices carrying across the water. At any moment, a landing party might come ashore and discover them. The crew knew what capture meant. Stories had circulated through the PT squadrons about what happened to American prisoners in the Solomons. Some were executed on the spot. Others were taken for interrogation, which in Japanese military culture often meant torture. A few were sent to prison camps, where they died of disease, starvation, or brutality. Almost none of them came home. The men kept watches, rotating shifts of 2 hours, scanning the horizon for any sign of approaching boats or aircraft. On the second afternoon, they spotted a Japanese barge passing through the strait, close enough that they could see figures moving on the deck. The men froze, pressing themselves flat on the sand, hearts pounding, barely breathing. The barge continued past without stopping. Whether the Japanese had looked toward the island and seen nothing, or whether they had simply not looked at all, the castaways never knew. Kennedy refused to wait passively for rescue. He understood that every hour they spent on plum pudding was an hour for the Japanese to find them, an hour for McMahon's infection to spread, an hour for the other men to weaken beyond recovery. They had to get a message out. They had to find help. Each night, Kennedy swam back out into the strait, hoping to intercept a friendly BPT boat from his own squadron. The American boats were still running patrols in these waters. If Kennedy could reach the shipping lane and signal a passing vessel, rescue would come within hours. It was a desperate, perhaps insane, plan. The strait was patrolled by Japanese vessels as well as American ones. In the darkness, Kennedy would be unable to distinguish friend from enemy until he was dangerously close. If he approached a Japanese destroyer by mistake, he would simply disappear, and his crew would never know what had happened to him. But there was no alternative. On the evening of August 3rd, Kennedy took one of the life jackets and the pistol wrapped in its protective shirt, left instructions with his executive officer, Ensign Leonard Tom, and slipped into the water. He swam for several hours, reaching Ferguson Passage, a narrow channel between islands where PT boats were known to transit. He treaded water in the darkness, waving a signal light fashioned from a flashlight wrapped in cloth, trying to attract the attention of any passing craft. No one came. The passage was empty. The PT squadrons had shifted their patrol areas that night, or they were running silent to avoid Japanese detection, or they simply did not see the tiny figure bobbing in the dark water. Kennedy waited until his arms gave out, then began the long swim back toward Plum Pudding Island. He did not make it directly. The current caught him sometime after midnight, sweeping him away from his intended course, pulling him out toward the open ocean. Kennedy fought against it, kicking and stroking, but he was already exhausted from hours of treading water and signaling. His muscles were failing, his back was seizing, the current was stronger. For several hours, Kennedy drifted alone in the Pacific darkness. He passed in and out of consciousness, hallucinating from dehydration and exhaustion, dreaming of rescue ships that vanished when he opened his eyes. He saw his family. He saw the warm rooms of the Kennedy compound in Hyannis Port. He saw his brothers, Joe and Bobby, standing on the deck of a ship that was not there. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent. The water remained warm, but felt like ice against his cramping limbs. At some point, he stopped trying to swim and simply floated, letting the current take him wherever it would, waiting to die. And then, near dawn, something changed. A tidal shift, an eddy, some quirk of the local hydrography caught Kennedy and reversed his direction. The current that had been dragging him out to sea now pushed him back toward land. He washed up on a different island, not Plum Pudding but a similar tiny atoll, and lay on the beach for hours before he was strong enough to swim back to his crew. When he finally returned to Plum Pudding, the men who had been watching for him had already begun to assume he was dead. Tom had started preparing them for the possibility that they would have to survive on their own, that their commander had drowned trying to save them. But Kennedy came back. By the fourth day, the situation had become critical. The coconuts were almost gone. McMahon's burns were clearly infected, the red streaks spreading up his arms toward his shoulders. Several of the other crew members were barely able to stand. Kennedy knew that if rescue did not come soon, they would start dying one by one until no one was left. He made the decision to move the group again, this time to a slightly larger island called Olasana, approximately 2 miles away. The island appeared to have more vegetation, which might mean more coconuts. It might also offer better concealment from Japanese patrols. The swim to Olasana was shorter than the original swim to Plum Pudding, but no easier. The men were weaker now, their reserves exhausted by days of hunger, thirst, and the grinding anxiety of survival. Kennedy once again towed McMahon, pulling him through the water with the life jacket strapped between his teeth. The other men straggled behind, some of them barely conscious by the time they reached shore. But they made it, and on Olasana, they found something that would change everything. Kennedy and one of his crew, Ensign Barney Ross, went exploring and discovered a Japanese supply cache hidden beneath some vegetation. It contained a small dugout canoe, some hardtack crackers, and, most precious of all, a barrel of rainwater that the Japanese must have stored for their own patrol crews. Kennedy and Ross dragged the supplies back to the group. For the first time in days, the men had real water to drink, real food to eat. It was not much, barely enough to sustain 11 men for more than a day or two, but it was enough to keep them alive a little longer. Ross took the canoe to continue searching the nearby islands, while Kennedy stayed with the main group, watching McMahon deteriorate, watching the other men weaken, counting the hours until the food and water ran out again. And then, on the 5th day, something happened that Kennedy could not have planned for. 2 Solomon Islander scouts paddled their canoe past Olasana Island and saw the Americans hiding in the vegetation. The scouts' names were Byuku Gasa and Ironi Kumana. They were coast watchers, local men who had volunteered to work with the Allied forces, reporting Japanese ship movements and helping stranded Americans escape. They were risking their lives every day because the Japanese executed any native caught helping the Allies. Gasa and Kumana approached the island cautiously, not entirely certain whether these bedraggled, sunburned men were Americans or Japanese. Kennedy emerged from the bushes and identified himself, speaking slowly, hoping the scouts could understand. They could. They spoke English, learned from Australian missionaries before the war. Kennedy explained the situation. 11 American sailors, stranded, no radio, no way to signal the American base at Rendova. Could the scouts get a message to the Allies? Gasa and Kumana nodded. They could paddle to Rendova. They knew the waters, and they knew how to avoid Japanese patrols. But the journey would take time, perhaps a day or more each way, and they had no paper, no pencil, nothing to write a message on. Kennedy looked around the island. He picked up a coconut shell, one of the many husks scattered across the sand. He borrowed a knife from one of the scouts, and using the blade, he carved a message into the hard surface of the shell. The message read, N-A-U-R-O-I-S-L Commander, Native knows Posset. He can pilot, 11 alive, needs small boat. Kennedy. 11 alive. 2 words that contained everything. The terror of the collision, the hours in the burning water, the 4-mile swim towing a helpless man, the days of thirst and fear on uninhabited islands, the absolute refusal to give up. Gasa and Kumana took the coconut and paddled away toward Rendova. For the next 35 hours, Kennedy and his crew waited. They had no way of knowing whether the scouts would make it, whether the message would be believed, whether rescue would come at all. They knew only that they had done everything they could, and now their fate was in the hands of 2 Solomon Islanders in a canoe. On the morning of August 8th, a PT boat appeared on the horizon. It was not a rescue boat in the formal sense. It was a regular patrol craft that had been diverted based on Gasa and Kumana's message. It cruised toward Olasana Island, slowing as it approached, and Kennedy swam out to meet it. 6 days after PT-109 had been cut in half by a Japanese destroyer, 11 men who had been left for dead climbed aboard a friendly vessel and began the journey home. If you've been watching this far, it means you're fascinated by incredible stories of survival and human endurance. Make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you don't miss our next deep dive into the most gripping moments of the Second World War. The rescue of PT-109's crew was celebrated as a triumph. Kennedy was awarded the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for his actions, cited for courage and leadership in saving his crew under impossible conditions. The story of the coconut message became famous, a perfect symbol of American ingenuity and determination. But there was another side to this story, a side that was carefully kept out of the newspapers. The destruction of PT-109 was not supposed to happen. A collision between a PT boat and a destroyer was extraordinarily unusual. PT boats were fast, maneuverable, and specifically designed to evade larger vessels. The fact that the Amagiri had managed to ram PT-109 at all suggested that something had gone badly wrong. Navy investigators began asking questions. Why was PT-109 idling on one engine in the middle of a combat zone? Why had Kennedy failed to spot the destroyer until it was too late? Why had the boat been unable to evade? The answers were uncomfortable. PT-109's engines had been running poorly for weeks. 2 of the 3 Packard motors were damaged and replacement parts were unavailable. Kennedy had been forced to idle on a single engine because running all 3 created too much wake and exhaust. This left him with almost no acceleration capability at the critical moment. The radar aboard PT-109 was malfunctioning. The radio communications that night had been a disaster, with multiple squadrons unable to coordinate effectively. Kennedy had received no warning of the approaching convoy and had only fragmentary information about enemy positions. And the Navy concluded that Kennedy bore no fault in the loss of his boat. The collision was deemed an operational accident, a consequence of poor equipment, bad communications, and the inherent dangers of PT combat. Kennedy was cleared of any blame. But this was not a failure of courage. It was a failure of planning. The story of PT-109 would go on to become one of the most famous narratives of the Second World War, but not because of what it revealed about naval warfare. It became famous because of John F. Kennedy. In 1960, Kennedy ran for president. His campaign made extensive use of the PT-109 story, presenting it as proof of his leadership, courage, and fitness for command. The coconut shell, still bearing his carved message, was displayed on his desk in the Oval Office after his election. The story was retold in books, magazine articles, and eventually a Hollywood film. The narrative was simple. Kennedy had saved his men through sheer determination, swimming for hours, ignoring his own injuries, refusing to give up. He was a hero. But there was always a quiet counter-narrative, one that his rivals and critics occasionally raised. Kennedy had lost his boat. He had been surprised by the enemy. 2 of his men had died in the collision. Was this really heroism, or was it merely survival after a mistake? The answer, of course, was more complicated than either version. War does not produce heroes by giving them perfect circumstances. It produces heroes by giving them impossible ones. Kennedy did not ask to have his boat cut in half. He did not choose to be marooned behind enemy lines. He did not volunteer to tow a burned crewman through 4 miles of open ocean with a life jacket strapped between his teeth. But when those circumstances arrived, he did not quit. That is not the same as glory. It is something harder to define. It is endurance when endurance is all that remains. The 11 survivors of PT-109 carried the experience with them for the rest of their lives. Most of them remained close to Kennedy, attending reunions, visiting the White House, speaking at commemorations. McMahon, the most badly injured, lived until 1978. He never forgot the hours that Kennedy had spent towing him through the water, refusing to let go, refusing to leave him behind. The two Solomon Islander scouts, Buku Gasa and Eroni Kumana, were largely forgotten by history for decades. It was not until 2002 that they received formal recognition from the United States, traveling to Washington to be honored at the Kennedy Library. They had saved 11 American lives with a coconut and a canoe, and almost nobody remembered their names. The Amagiri, the destroyer that struck a PT-109, continued to serve in the Japanese Navy for another year. In April 1944, it struck a mine in the Makassar Strait and sank with all hands. The same ship that had unknowingly created the Kennedy legend was destroyed by the same kind of hidden weapon that PT boats were designed to deploy. The wreck of PT-109 was not located until 2002, when an expedition led by Robert Ballard, the discoverer of the Titanic, found debris from the boat scattered across the sea floor. The remains of Marnie and Kirksey, the two crewmen killed in the collision, were never recovered. And that brings us to the meaning of this story. What happened in Blacksand Strait on August 2, 1943, was not a great naval victory. It was not a decisive battle. It was a disaster, a small wooden boat crushed by a steel destroyer in 30 seconds of chaos and fire. But from that disaster came something else. The men who survived did not survive because they were lucky. They survived because one of them refused to stop. Kennedy made a decision in that burning water, in those first minutes after the collision, that he would not let his crew die. And then he made that decision again, every hour, for 6 days, until rescue arrived. This is the uncomfortable truth about leadership in extremis. It is not about brilliance. It is not about strategy. It is about refusing to quit when quitting would be understandable, perhaps even forgivable. Kennedy went on to become President of the United States. His critics would always point to PT-109 as a question mark, a story that did not quite fit the heroic mold. His supporters would point to it as proof that he could be trusted in a crisis. Both sides were probably right. What matters most is what the 11 survivors knew, the men who had been there, who had swum through those waters, who had lain on that island waiting to die or be rescued. They knew what Kennedy had done. They never forgot. There is a phrase that appears in almost every account of disaster at sea. It comes up again and again in survivor testimonies, in official reports, in the quiet conversations that veterans have with each other decades after the war. We held on. It is not a dramatic phrase. It is not inspiring in the way that charges and victories and flag raisings are inspiring, but it is the core of survival. When the fuel burned on the water, they held on. When the current dragged them out to sea, they held on. When the coconuts ran out and the Japanese planes circled overhead, they held on. And when the PT boat finally appeared, on the morning of August 8th, slicing through the water toward their island, the 11 men who had been left for dead climbed into it and went home. Most of them lived long lives. They married, raised families, grew old. McMahon's scars faded, but never disappeared. Kennedy's back problems grew worse over the years. a constant reminder of the punishment his body had taken in the Pacific. But none of them ever forgot Blackson Strait. If this story moved you, if you want to understand more about the desperate small boat actions of the Pacific War, consider subscribing to join our community of history enthusiasts. Every week, we uncover forgotten stories of survival, courage, and the thin line between victory and disaster. The coconut shell still exists. It sits now in the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum in Boston, a relic of the most desperate message ever sent. The words are still visible, scratched into the rough surface with a borrowed knife. 11 alive. Those two words contain everything. The horror of the collision, the hours in the water, the days of waiting, the refusal to give up. 19 years after Blackson Strait, John F. Kennedy stood in the White House during the Cuban Missile Crisis, facing the possibility of nuclear war. The world held its breath. The decisions he made in those 13 days may have prevented the destruction of civilization itself. There is no way to know what he was thinking during those meetings. There is no way to connect the lieutenant who towed a burned sailor through 4 miles of ocean to the president who faced down the Soviet Union. But perhaps the connection is simpler than it appears. In both cases, he did not quit. Some men discover what they are made of in the ordinary course of life, in small tests, in manageable difficulties. Others discover it all at once, in fire and darkness and the absolute certainty that no one is coming to save them. John Kennedy was 26 years old when he learned what he was capable of. He learned it in the water, in the dark, with the strap of a life jacket between his teeth, and a man who could not swim, depending on him to keep moving. He did not stop, and 11 men came home. The debris of PT-109 still lies on the floor of Blackson Strait, 3,000 feet down, scattered across a muddy slope that has never seen sunlight. The engines are there, and the torpedo tubes, and the fragments of the hull that was cut in half by a destroyer no one ever saw coming. It is not a grave exactly. The men who died there were never found. But it is a memorial, unvisited by anyone except the creatures that live in that permanent darkness. Above, the same waters still flow through the Solomon Islands. The same currents that dragged Kennedy out to sea on the third night still move through the strait, indifferent to history. And somewhere in Boston, in a climate-controlled room in a museum dedicated to a president who died 20 years after Blackson Strait, a coconut shell sits in a display case. The words are still legible. 11 alive. A message carved in desperation, carried by 2 islanders in a canoe, delivered to an American base 30 miles away. It is the simplest possible proof that survival is not about luck or strength or skill. It is about refusing to let go.